Good morning. I wanted to share something this morning. I just finished reading this book. It's called Jesus for the Non-Religious by Bishop John Shelby Spong. Shelby Spong is not with us anymore, but he was an Episcopal bishop. So he has been in religion for a number of years, definitely, and knows what he's talking about. I've known about this book for a long, long time, but finally got around to reading it. Actually, I read it twice with some months in between. It is difficult for me to absorb everything in a book the first time around, and I'm sure I'm going to need to read it several other times later. But the reason I read it is because I wanted to find out who God is. I've been seeing people referring to God as she, but I always thought that, I know their intention is good, they wanted to expand who God is, but I can only see that as completely as inadequate as calling him he. He is not a he is not a she. We don't really know, we don't really have language to describe who he is. So the best we can do is to use whatever pronoun you feel is best. But it's important because we, in our mission statement here for New Covenant House, we have we say that we are to love God and we are to love one another. So in other words, for us to love God, we need to know who he is. So this was one of the steps that I took to kind of answer that question. Not that I actually got the answer, but I got a lot of insight that I didn't have before from this book. I think he's trying to make a lot of the same point that others are doing, in a book named Divided by Faith, and another one called Unchristian, and just more recently I figured out a book called You Lost Me that kind of conclude that the religion as we know it does not attract anybody. If anything, it'll repel people. As soon as you start talking about religion, people say, oh no, I'm gone. So, and I think Shelby Spong is also making that point that if we want Jesus to be important in our lives, we need to find different language to talk about him. But anyway, so the book is in 3 parts. It's pretty easy to read. There isn't that much that trips you up along the way, and you have to do other research. But the first part, he's calling it Separating the Human Jesus from the Myth. And the starting point is that something extraordinary happened to this man called Jesus in the first century. But there was nothing written down about it. He didn't write anything himself, and it took at least 20 years before anybody with any kind of knowledge about him started writing things down. And I'm thinking here about Paul, who is probably the closest eyewitness you can get, because he actually met Peter, who was with. So that's probably the closest we can get to that, but everything else is written decades after the events. And you probably heard about this children's game called Telephone, where you tell a little story and to one person, and then the person will then tell it to another and another and another, and by the time you get to the end, it has changed completely. And that's exactly what happened here. in the Gospels did not have the intention to write any historical account of who Jesus is. It is all liturgy. So this Spong is using the first part of the book to strip away all those things that have been added onto him, like the miracles and raising people from the dead, and even the crucifixion the birth is described in ways that just didn't happen that way. So that's the first step. In the second part of the book, he's original images of Jesus, and in this part he again, it's not historical account, it's liturgy. It's written by Jews in a Jewish context, and they are fitting him into the prophecies that have been made about him in Isaiah and Zechariah, I think. So that's what he's doing in the second part. In the third part, this is where it gets a little bit more difficult for me to follow, but it talks about religion, and it talks about what religion is for, what it does for us. It kind of like tries to keep us safe. We need to have a way to have somebody who will take care of us if calamities happen to us. So that is how God came into human existence. But he's concluding that the language that we have about religion today is, like I think I said that before already, that Christianity and much other religion repels people rather than attracts people. So what he's saying is that Jesus was a man, and he doesn't really, he says that he sees God through Jesus, because this Jesus was extraordinary. And that is how we were originally created. If we go back to the traditional thinking, we were created as good, but until the fall, there was no such concept of the opposite, of evil. The tree of good and evil doesn't mean that you know now the difference between good and evil. You just know now that there is something called evil as well. And so without the fall, there would be no evil in the world. But there is. So Jesus is the one who knows good and only good, because God created everything as good, and He's calling him the Father. So Jesus didn't come up with all these things. He has a source where they come from, and that is God, who he calls Father. But I don't really think that Bishop Spong, he has a concept of God, and he knows that there is a God, but he thinks Jesus as mostly human. So that's pretty much where it ends. But the conclusion is that Christianity, as we know, we've known it for hundreds and hundreds of years, is no longer working. We have to find a way to reformulate it so that people of our days can understand it and want to talk about it. So that's pretty much what I have for this book. I'm sure there's going to be more. So thank you for listening.